Part 1, The Innocent Question. The red dust of Kepler 442b swirled around Tommy's worn sneakers as he stepped carefully through the ancient ruins. The 12-year-old boy had always been curious about everything, much to his parents' constant worry. Today was supposed to be a simple field trip with his class to see the old Zorathian temples, but something about the strange symbols carved into the weathered stone pillars made him want to look closer. "Tommy, stay with the group," called Mrs. Patterson, their teacher, but her voice seemed distant as Tommy wandered toward a particularly interesting section of wall. The markings here were different from the others. They seemed to shimmer and pulse with a faint blue light that made his eyes water if he stared too long. The other students were busy taking pictures and chattering about lunch, but Tommy found himself drawn to a small alcove where the symbols formed perfect circles around what looked like a handprint. He reached out, his small fingers tracing the ancient grooves in the stone. The material felt warm under his touch, almost alive. "Why do they glow like that?" he whispered to himself, pressing his palm against the handprint. It fit perfectly, as if made for someone exactly his size. The moment his skin made full contact with the stone, everything changed. A deep humming sound filled the air, growing louder and more intense by the second. The blue glow spread from the handprint outward, racing along every carved line and symbol until the entire wall blazed with brilliant light. Tommy tried to pull his hand away, but found he couldn't move. The stone held him fast, and strange images began flooding his mind. He saw great ships sailing between stars, beings of incredible beauty and terrible power, wars that lasted centuries, and civilizations rising and falling like waves on an endless shore. But more than that, he felt their emotions, their pride, their fear, their desperate need to be remembered. "What did you do?" The voice was sharp and filled with panic. Tommy turned to see a tall, thin alien with silver skin and too many eyes rushing toward him. This was Instructor Kithara, their Zorathian guide, and she looked absolutely terrified. I just wanted to know why they glowed," Tommy said, finally able to pull his hand free as the light began to fade. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break anything." But Kithara wasn't listening. She was speaking rapidly into a communication device, her voice high and urgent. Within minutes, the peaceful archaeological site was swarming with Zorathian security forces. They moved with military precision, surrounding the confused human students and their teacher while keeping their weapons trained on young Tommy. "Step away from the child," ordered their commander, a massive Zorathian with scars covering his silver hide. "The sacred memory core has been contaminated by alien touch. This is a violation of the highest order." Tommy's classmates began to cry. Mrs. Patterson tried to explain that it was just an accident, that Tommy didn't understand what he was doing. But the Zorathians weren't interested in explanations. To them, the boy had committed an unforgivable sin. He had touched something sacred with unworthy hands, triggering defenses that had slept for 1,000 years. As they bound Tommy's wrists with energy restraints that felt cold against his skin, he kept trying to apologize. He didn't understand why touching an old carving was such a big deal. He certainly didn't understand why the normally friendly Zorathians were treating him like a dangerous criminal. "Please," he said to the commander, his voice small and frightened. "I really didn't mean to do anything wrong. Can't you just tell me what I'm not supposed to touch next time?" The commander's many eyes fixed on him with something that might have been pity. "There will be no next time, young human. The Galactic Council will decide your fate now. You have awakened something that should have stayed sleeping forever." As they dragged him toward their ship, Tommy caught one last glimpse of the wall he had touched. The symbols were dark now, but somehow he could still feel them humming in the back of his mind, showing him images of vast fleets and terrible weapons. He didn't understand what any of it meant, but deep down, he had the terrible feeling that his simple question had started something that couldn't be stopped. The ship's engines roared to life, carrying one frightened boy toward a judgment that would shake the foundations of the galaxy itself. Part 2, The Tribunal's Judgment. The Grand Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime had never seen such a gathering. Representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy filled the towering circular chamber, their varied forms creating a tapestry of colors, shapes, and sizes that would have fascinated Tommy under different circumstances. Instead, the 12-year-old boy stood in the center of the room, small and alone, surrounded by beings who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be solved. General Marcus Webb sat in the human delegation section, his weathered face carved from stone as he watched the proceedings. The 40-year veteran had seen combat on 17 different worlds, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Beside him, his aide whispered updates from Earth, but Webb barely heard them. His entire focus was on the frightened child standing trial for the crime of curiosity. High Arbiter Salvan, a crystalline being whose voice rang like wind chimes, called the session to order. We gather today to address the contamination of the sacred memory core of Zora the Prime. The accused stands before us, one Tommy Chen of the planet Earth. The boy looked even smaller under the harsh lights of the chamber. His school clothes were wrinkled from days in detention, and his eyes were red from crying. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as barely a whisper. "I just wanted to know why it glowed," Tommy said, the same words he had repeated countless times since his arrest. "Nobody told me I wasn't supposed to touch it." A wave of disapproving sounds rippled through the assembly. Counselor Vrex, whose tentacles writhed with agitation, slammed his gavel. Ignorance is no excuse for desecration. The sacred memory cores are known throughout the galaxy as forbidden to all but the chosen ones. General Webb stood slowly, his uniform crisp despite the long journey to Nexus Prime. "If I may address the tribunal," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The child is 12 years old. He has never left his home system before this educational trip. How could he be expected to know laws that were never explained to him?" "The laws are universal," hissed Magistrate Thyss, her serpentine form coiling around her speaking platform. "All civilized beings understand the concept of sacred spaces. That this, human, does not only proves their species' barbaric nature." Tommy flinched at the word barbaric, and Webb felt his jaw clench. Around the chamber, other delegates nodded in agreement. To them, humanity was still a young race, barely worthy of their attention except as a source of amusement or concern. "The sacred memory core has been tainted," declared Arbiter Salvan. "The ancient knowledge it contained has been corrupted by contact with an unworthy mind. The Zorathians demand justice for this unprecedented violation." The Zorathian delegation, led by High Priest Kalen, stood as one. "The memories of our ancestors cry out for vengeance," Kalen intoned. "This child has stolen something that can never be returned. The penalty for such theft is clear: immediate termination." A collective gasp went up from the human delegation, but Webb remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. "And what of the principle of proportional justice?" he asked calmly. "What of the concept that punishment should fit the crime?" "You're talking about executing a child for touching a wall." "A sacred wall," corrected Counselor Vrex. "The most sacred wall in Zorathian history. The boy's touch has awakened defenses that have slept for millennia, disrupted systems that took our ancestors centuries to perfect. The damage cannot be undone." Tommy finally found his voice, though it shook with fear. "But I saw things," he said, louder now. "When I touched it, I saw your history. I saw your wars, your triumphs, your people crying for help. I didn't steal anything, I shared in it. Isn't that what memories are for?" The chamber fell silent. For a moment, even the ambient hum of the space station seemed to pause. Then High Priest Kalen spoke, his voice filled with rage. "You dare to speak of what you saw? You dare to claim understanding of our sacred heritage? You are nothing but a primitive creature who has contaminated our most holy relic." General Webb had heard enough. He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor. "This tribunal is a farce," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "You've already decided the boy's fate. You're not here for justice, you're here for a show. General Webb, Arbiter Salvin warned, you are out of order. No, Webb replied, his eyes never leaving Tommy's frightened face. What's out of order is condemning a child to death for the crime of wonder. What's out of order is a galaxy that has forgotten what it means to show mercy to the innocent. The vote was swift and predictable. Only 3 civilizations voted against the death sentence: the humans, the Centaurians, and surprisingly, the vegan collective. Everyone else raised their hands, sealing Tommy's fate with casual indifference. As the energy restraints were placed around Tommy's small wrists, he looked up at General Webb with eyes full of tears. "Will you tell my mom and dad that I'm sorry?" he whispered. Webb knelt down, ignoring the weapons trained on him. "You have nothing to be sorry for, son," he said quietly. "You did nothing wrong. Remember that." As they led Tommy away, General Webb activated his secure communicator. Earth needed to know what had happened here. More importantly, Earth needed to know that the galaxy had just made a terrible mistake. Part 3, Earth's Silent Rage. The message reached Earth Command exactly 47 minutes after Tommy Chen's execution. Admiral James Sterling stood in the command center's main briefing room, surrounded by the most powerful military minds in human space, and watched the holographic recording of the trial's final moments. The silence that followed was deafening. On the screen, a 12-year-old boy who had never hurt anyone was led to his death by beings who claimed to represent justice and civilization. The execution itself was mercifully quick, a single pulse of energy that made Tommy's small form simply cease to exist. But the casual way the alien delegates had discussed it, as if they were debating the weather, made Sterling's blood run cold. "Play it again," he said quietly. "Sir, we've already," began Colonel Morrison, but Sterling's raised hand cut him off. "Play it again." For the 3rd time, they watched Tommy ask his innocent question about the glowing symbols. They watched him touch the wall with the wonder of a child discovering something new. They watched him try to apologize, to explain, to make sense of a situation that made no sense at all. And then they watched him die. Admiral Sterling was 63 years old. He had been in the military for 42 years, had commanded fleets in 3 different wars, and had seen more death than any human should. But he had never felt rage like this before. It was a cold, calculating fury that settled into his bones and made his hands shake with the effort of control. "How long?" he asked finally. "Sir?" Morrison looked confused. "How long have we been hiding our true capabilities from the galaxy?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Everyone in the room knew the answer, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Humanity had been playing a careful game for decades, presenting themselves as a minor species while secretly developing technologies that would make the other civilizations very nervous. 73 years, came the answer from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the head of Advanced Weapons Development. "Ever since the Proxima incident showed us what happens to species that appear too powerful too quickly." Sterling nodded slowly. The Proxima incident had been humanity's introduction to galactic politics. A peaceful mining colony had been preemptively neutralized by a coalition of older civilizations who decided the humans were advancing too rapidly. 3 million people had died in the space of an hour, and Earth had learned a valuable lesson about keeping secrets. "And our current fleet strength?" Sterling asked. "Officially? 12 battle groups, mostly defensive in nature," replied Fleet Admiral Chen, no relation to Tommy, but the shared name made everyone in the room wince. "Unofficially? We have capabilities that would make the Galactic Council wet themselves." The blunt assessment brought a few grim smiles. For 7 decades, humanity had been building in secret. Hidden shipyards in the Outer Rim, cloaked research stations in dead systems, weapons that existed only in the deepest black projects. The galaxy thought Earth was a minor player with a small fleet and limited technology. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "What are our options?" Sterling asked. Dr. Reeves activated a holographic display showing the galaxy's major civilizations. We could target their infrastructure, hit their command centers, disrupt their communications, make them understand that actions have consequences. Or, added Colonel Morrison, we could go for surgical strikes. Take out their leadership, create chaos in their chain of command. Sterling studied the display, but his mind kept returning to Tommy's face in those final moments. The boy had been confused, frightened, but not angry. Even facing death, he had tried to understand what he had done wrong. The aliens had shown him no such consideration. No, Sterling said finally. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. We're going to make them understand exactly what they've done. He turned to address the room. For 73 years, we've hidden our strength. We've let them think of us as primitives, as children playing at being adults. They've patronized us, dismissed us, and now they've murdered one of our children for the crime of curiosity. The Admiral's voice grew colder with each word. They want to see what barbarians look like? They want to understand what happens when you kill the innocent? Then by God, we'll show them. The orders went out within the hour. Hidden fleets began moving toward their targets. Sleeper agents across the galaxy activated protocols that had been in place for decades. Technologies that had been theoretical became suddenly very real. Earth's response would not be quick. It would not be merciful. It would be thorough, devastating, and completely without warning. The galaxy had made its choice when it condemned Tommy Chen to death. Now it would learn what choice it had really made. Admiral Sterling stood alone in his office, looking out at the stars that had once seemed so welcoming. Tomorrow, some of those stars would go dark. Entire civilizations would discover that they had gravely miscalculated the cost of their cruelty. Tommy Chen had died asking a simple question: why do they glow like that? The galaxy was about to learn the answer to a much more terrible question: what happens when you push humanity too far? Part 4, The Reckoning begins. Colonel David Cross had been in special operations for 23 years, but he had never led a mission quite like this one. Standing in the briefing room of the stealth ship Retribution, he looked out at the faces of the most elite soldiers humanity had ever produced. They were about to undertake simultaneous strikes across 17 different star systems, and every one of them understood that they were writing a new chapter in galactic history. Operation Broken Covenant begins in 6 hours, Cross announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. Our targets are not military installations. They are not strategic resources. They are the symbols of the civilizations that voted to execute Tommy Chen. The holographic display showed their first target, the crystal spires of Tyson Prime, where the Zorathian High Council made their home. The towering structures had stood for 3,000 years, considered one of the wonders of the galaxy. In 6 hours, they would be dust. Sir, asked Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim, what about civilian casualties? Cross had expected the question. Our intelligence indicates that the government districts will be largely empty due to the Harmony Festival. We're not targeting civilians, we're targeting the symbols of their authority. But understand this, they showed no concern for innocence when they killed a 12-year-old boy. Our restraint is a courtesy they do not deserve. The mission briefings continued for another hour, covering everything from approach vectors to extraction protocols. Each team had been training for scenarios like this for years, but none of them had ever imagined they would be used for revenge. The galaxy's oldest civilizations were about to learn that humanity's patience had limits. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, Admiral Sterling watched from the bridge of the dreadnought Nemesis as his fleet prepared for the largest military operation in human history. The ship itself was a marvel of hidden technology, 3 kilometers of armor and weapons that officially didn't exist. Around it, 200 similar vessels hung in the void like sleeping predators. All teams report ready, announced Fleet Admiral Chen. Operation Broken Covenant is a go. The first strike hit the Zorathian homeworld at precisely 0300 local time. The crystal spires, which had weathered wars, natural disasters, and the rise and fall of governments, simply ceased to exist. One moment they were gleaming in the light of Tyson Prime's twin suns, the next they were a cloud of glittering dust settling over the empty government district. The Zorathians' first reaction was confusion. Their sensors couldn't identify the attacking ships, and their communications were being jammed by technologies they didn't recognize. By the time they managed to raise the alarm, the human fleet was already moving to its next target. On Nexus Prime, the Grand Assembly Hall where Tommy had been condemned was reduced to molten metal. The carefully maintained neutrality of the station was shattered in minutes as human boarding parties seized control of the Central Command Center. Delegates who had voted for death found themselves prisoners of the species they had dismissed as primitive. High Arbiter Salvan, the crystalline being who had pronounced Tommy's sentence, was awakened by the sound of his palace walls cracking. He emerged from his chambers to find Colonel Cross standing in his reception hall, surrounded by soldiers whose armor bore the image of a small boy reaching toward a glowing wall. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Salvan demanded, his voice ringing with outrage. Cross removed his helmet, revealing a face that might have been carved from granite. "You executed a child for touching a wall," he said simply. "We're here to teach you about consequences. You cannot do this." Salvan protested. "The Galactic Accords forbid." "The Galactic Accords died with Tommy Chen," Cross interrupted. "You made your choice when you voted for his execution. Now you live with ours." Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. The Centaurian Archive, repository of 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge, was systematically copied and then destroyed. The vegan collective's trade centers, which had controlled commerce for centuries, were reduced to rubble. Counselor Vrexa's private retreat, where he had celebrated Tommy's death with expensive wine, became a crater visible from orbit. The alien civilizations tried to respond, but their fleets were designed for show rather than warfare. They had grown complacent in their dominance, assuming that their technological superiority would protect them. They were wrong. Human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking without warning and vanishing before retaliation was possible. Their weapons were precise, their tactics flawless, and their message unmistakable: the age of human subservience was over. Within 48 hours, the galaxy's power structure had been completely overturned. Governments that had ruled for millennia found themselves hiding in bunkers, their fleets scattered and their authority shattered. The beings who had casually voted to execute a curious child now lived in constant fear of humanity's next move. But the humans weren't finished. Admiral Sterling's voice echoed across every communication channel in the galaxy, carried by technology that made their jamming attempts look like children's toys. "You killed an innocent child," his words rang out across 1,000 worlds. "You showed no mercy to someone who had never harmed anyone. You treated his death as entertainment, as a demonstration of your power over lesser beings. Now you know what power really looks like." The message was clear: humanity was no longer asking for a place at the galactic table. They were taking it, and they would decide who else deserved to sit there.